Surviving a medieval winter was not just about enduring the cold, but fighting against the relentless elements that threatened daily survival. The cold was a serious threat to life, especially when the fire, which was essential for warmth, could not be maintained. In medieval homes, the hearth was more than a place to cook food. It was the heart of the home, where life itself depended on its constant glow. For most families, there was no backup plan. Without the fire, survival in the cold would have been nearly impossible. Wood, the most essential fuel, had to be carefully gathered before winter's full force arrived. It wasn't just about storing enough. It was about rationing it wisely to last through the entire season. Cutting wood was a physically demanding task, often requiring long hours of labor to secure enough for the household. Families had to be prepared for the worst, knowing that the harsh winter could isolate them from the rest of the world for days or even weeks. The fire was often fueled by wood gathered from the surrounding forests or common lands. However, the availability of firewood could diminish during particularly long winters. In some areas, deforestation and overuse had depleted the wood supply, forcing families to find alternative sources such as peat, animal dung, or even refuse. These were far less effective than wood, producing more smoke, which only added to the discomfort inside the house. The task of collecting enough firewood was often shared by everyone in the household, including children, who would help gather kindling to keep the fire alive. As the winter progressed, families had to constantly monitor the fire, adding more wood to keep it going, and in case it went out, they relied on embers to restart it. Layered clothing was another key method for survival, especially when facing the biting cold. The clothing most commonly used during medieval winters was wool, as it provided warmth even when wet. People wore multiple layers of woolen tunics, cloaks, and leggings to trap air and insulate the body. Wool was also relatively inexpensive and could be woven locally, making it accessible for most people. For those who could afford it, fur-lined cloaks and tunics were an added luxury, offering an additional barrier against the cold. Nobles, for example, wore fur-lined garments from animals like foxes, minks, and rabbits. These coats were prized not only for their warmth, but also for their symbolic value. Furs were a visible marker of social status, though only the wealthiest could afford them. Fur-lined garments helped protect the wealthier classes against the cold, but the most common folk had to make do with simpler woolen cloaks. In areas where fur was hard to come by, people turned to the simplest wool for clothing. The process of layering was essential. In poorer families, where resources were scarce, even the woolen garments were often worn until they were threadbare. People in rural areas were typically able to gather coarse wool from their own sheep, but the quality of the fabric varied depending on how well the animals were cared for. Wool was spun into thread and then woven into garments for the entire family. At night, families often slept in their woolen garments, piling on blankets to retain body heat. In many cases, people slept on the floor, sometimes simply lying on a straw mattress or directly on the earth. Those who could afford beds often had feather mattresses, but the cold air still found its way inside. One of the major issues people faced during a medieval winter was the difficulty of keeping both the house and themselves warm. Even if a fire was maintained, medieval homes were typically built with very few defenses against the cold. Stone and wood houses were drafty, and gaps between the walls, windows, and doors allowed the cold air to creep in. Cold winds would enter the house even when the fire was burning, making the hearth seem almost futile. Medieval homes were not designed for comfort. They were functional, but left much to be desired. On a freezing night, it wasn't unusual for people to feel as cold indoors as they would outside. Some houses did have insulation in the form of thick walls, but this could only do so much. The use of blankets was critical for survival, and they became indispensable to medieval families. These blankets were often made of wool or animal skins, which provided extra insulation against the cold. In wealthier homes, especially castles, larger fires were set in stone fireplaces, which could provide heat for larger spaces. Still, many parts of castles remained cold, and cold air found its way into even the most fortified buildings. Wealthy individuals often kept themselves warm with the help of heating stones or braziers, which were portable and could be moved from one room to another. These were small iron vessels used to burn charcoal or wood. They could be placed near the bed at night or used to warm hands and feet. Though helpful, they were limited in how much warmth they could provide, especially in larger spaces. The animals played a significant role in helping people stay warm during the winter. It was common for livestock, like cows, sheep, and pigs, to be kept indoors during the cold months. In homes without enough space, families often shared their living space with the animals. The warmth produced by large animals helped increase the temperature of the house, even if only slightly. However, keeping animals indoors also had its drawbacks, the most obvious being filth. Livestock produced large amounts of waste, and the poor conditions often led to unsanitary living environments. Despite these issues, the warmth provided by the animals was an invaluable resource. In wealthier homes, animals were kept in separate buildings or rooms, but in rural homes, this was not an option. While animals helped with warmth, they also contributed to the survival of medieval people in other ways. Meat, milk, and eggs provided critical nutrients during the long, cold months. Preserved meats, like pork or smoked fish, could be stored for months. In more affluent households, dried fruits or cured meats were added to winter meals, providing both warmth and sustenance. For poorer families, root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and onions were essential for winter survival. These vegetables were grown during the warmer months and stored in cool, dry cellars. In Northern Europe, preserved foods such as cabbages, potatoes, and wheat played a major role in winter meals. Drinks were also a vital part of medieval winter survival. Ale was the most common winter drink, consumed by both adults and children. It was seen as both hydrating and warming, especially when served in large quantities. Spiced wine or mead, flavored with cinnamon and ginger, became especially popular during the winter months. Warm drinks, particularly mulled wine, were thought to raise the body's temperature and help people stave off the cold, even though the hearth was essential to warmth. One of the biggest threats medieval people faced was winter diseases. Cold, damp air and poor living conditions created a fertile breeding ground for illness. Respiratory diseases like pneumonia, tuberculosis, and bronchitis were common, as were bacterial infections brought on by unsanitary conditions. The cold air weakened people's immune systems, making them more susceptible to illness. In the absence of modern medicine, diseases often spread rapidly. Frostbite was another serious condition that could result in amputation if left untreated. Medieval people often lacked the knowledge to properly treat these ailments. For those who were affected, their chances of survival were slim without a medical intervention. Many medieval communities lived in isolation during the winter months, especially in rural areas. Long snowstorms could trap people in their homes. For days, travel was difficult, and only those with horses or sledges could manage to travel during severe snowstorms. But for most people, winter was a time of confinement, both physically and socially. People huddled together in homes near the hearth, spending hours talking, playing games, and telling stories to pass the time. The long hours indoors created an opportunity for social bonding. In the absence of television or entertainment, oral traditions of storytelling became important forms of communication. It was during these long winter nights that families passed down folklore, legends, and history through storytelling. The ability to survive a medieval winter depended heavily on community. Families, neighbors, and villagers worked together to ensure that they could endure the cold. In times of extreme hardship, charity and mutual aid played vital roles in the survival of many. Those with extra food or firewood shared it with others. It wasn't uncommon for towns and villages to organize community feasts during the winter months to help people who couldn't afford enough to eat. If there was a famine or bad harvest, communities would band together to ration what little food there was to ensure that everyone had enough to survive. Medieval winters were harsh, and the methods to survive them were as varied as the people who lived through them. The extreme conditions of winter required people to think beyond simple clothing and food storage, demanding a deeper level of adaptation and resourcefulness. In rural areas, where isolation from larger towns or cities was common, individuals and families faced even greater challenges in enduring the winter. The ability to survive in these isolated areas often depended not only on personal preparation but also on the strength of community bonds and mutual aid. Community support during the winter months was crucial. No one person could fully prepare for winter on their own, and families often relied on shared resources to make it through. Villages and towns had networks of support that extended well beyond the immediate family. When a family had an inadequate amount of firewood or food, they could turn to their neighbors for help. Creating a system where resources were pooled together, community feasts were an important tradition in many medieval villages. When the harvests had been good, or if one family had an excess of provisions, the whole community would come together to share what they had. This was not only a matter of generosity, but of survival. A bad harvest or a particularly harsh winter could cause widespread hunger, so community feasts ensured that no one was left without enough to eat. These gatherings were also opportunities for people to strengthen social ties and ensure that relationships remained intact when resources were scarce in some regions. There were also village cooperatives that helped with shared tasks, like cutting firewood or building shelters. For example, woodcutting was often done in teams, especially when the forest was far from the village. Villagers would share tools, divide up tasks, and bring back wood together, ensuring that no one went without. Even people who lived in small towns near larger urban areas relied on these communal strategies to gather firewood, food, and other essentials for surviving the winter. In areas where towns were more developed, there were communal stores, public granaries, or firewood depots, where villagers could store their goods to share when times got tough. These stores were maintained by local authorities, and the idea behind them was simple. When some families couldn't keep up with the demands of winter, these stores would provide relief. This was vital during particularly harsh winters when weather conditions or poor harvests left people without enough supplies. The concept of mutual aid went beyond sharing tangible resources. It was also about offering physical and emotional support. Sickness was prevalent during the winter months, and many people particularly the elderly or the ill, would require help to survive the cold. Children were often tasked with running errands for their elders, fetching firewood, or collecting water from frozen wells. Even the poorest members of society would have some form of assistance, as people understood the need to protect one another. While the fire was at the heart of the medieval home, the structure of the home itself also played a significant role in determining how well people survived the cold. Stone and wooden buildings provided some level of insulation, but these homes were rarely sealed tight against the cold. People had to get creative to make their homes livable during the winter. One technique used by families to survive the cold was to seal up cracks in the walls of their homes with mud, straw, or cloth. Gaps in the walls were common, especially in homes made from wattle and daub-woven wooden sticks covered with mud or stone. These homes were built to provide shelter, but they weren't designed with insulation in mind. If the house was left as it was, the wind would blow straight through the cracks, making it even colder inside. To combat this, families would stuff any available materials into the cracks, such as hay, straw, or even rags. These temporary fixes helped keep the cold out, but they also made the homes more difficult to ventilate, sometimes increasing the risk of disease. People would also use heavy curtains or blankets to cover windows or doorways, trapping warmth inside and helping to keep the cold air out. In the wealthier homes, glass windows were more common, but even these weren't fully effective in blocking out the cold. The use of curtains or tapestries to cover windows was one way to protect against the biting cold. In rural homes, where windows were often open or covered only by wooden shutters, these kinds of makeshift barriers helped minimize heat loss. Another adaptation made to homes in the winter was removable bedding. People would stack several layers of blankets, straw, and hay to sleep on. By elevating the sleeping area off the cold floor, the bed was kept warmer. Sleeping near the hearth helped, but it was often too difficult to keep a fire burning throughout the night. By having warm bedding, people could huddle together and trap their body heat beneath the blankets, increasing their chances of surviving the night. Feather beds, though a luxury for the rich, were highly coveted and were often passed down through generations. These soft beds provided insulation and comfort that were rare for the common folk. During the long winter months, food preservation was an essential part of survival. Without refrigeration, medieval people had to rely on a variety of methods to ensure that their food lasted throughout the winter. The most common methods of preservation were salting, drying, smoking, and pickling. Salted meats were a staple of the winter diet, especially in rural areas. Pork and beef were the most commonly preserved meats, and these were salted in large quantities to ensure they could last for months. The process of salting meat involved rubbing it with salt and sometimes sugar or other preservative agents, and then leaving it in a cool, dry place. Smoking was another method used to preserve meat, particularly in the colder northern regions. Smoked fish and smoked sausages were common and provided both nutrition and warmth during the winter. Pickling vegetables was also an important technique. People would pickle onions, cabbages, cucumbers, and other vegetables in vinegar or salt water to keep them fresh during the winter months. These pickled foods added essential nutrients to the winter diet when fresh vegetables weren't available. Cabbages and root vegetables, like turnips and parsnips, could be stored in cellars or buried in the ground to keep them fresh for months. If the winter wasn't too harsh, it was possible to grow cold weather crops in specially prepared winter gardens or cold frames. Though the amount of food grown was limited, In the wealthier households, the use of preserved fruits such as dried apples, figs, and raisins was also common. These dried fruits were not only used for nutrition, but also for making preserves and jams, providing a sweet treat during the long, cold months. Honey was often used as a natural sweetener, as it could be stored indefinitely and didn't spoil. In addition to food, the drink also played a critical role. Ale was the drink of choice for most medieval people, as it was considered both nutritious and comforting. Spiced wine, mulled wine, and mead were commonly consumed during the winter months to help keep people warm. These beverages often included cinnamon, cloves, ginger, and nutmeg, ingredients that were not only flavorful but also helped stimulate warmth and improve digestion during the winter months. Illness was a constant threat. The cold, the lack of sanitation, and the close quarters in which people lived made it easy for diseases to spread. Respiratory infections, such as bronchitis and pneumonia, were the most common, especially for those who were already weakened by the cold. The lack of modern medical knowledge and treatments meant that many people died from these diseases. To combat the cold and prevent illness, people relied on herbal remedies. Herbal teas made from peppermint, chamomile, ginger, and rose hips were consumed to provide warmth, soothe the throat, and treat respiratory problems. Garlic was another common remedy, known for its supposed healing properties. It was often eaten raw, made into garlic oil, or used in soups. Other herbs like sage and thyme were used for their antiseptic properties, and wine was often infused with these herbs to fight off illness. Despite the efforts of the medieval community to stave off illness with herbs and other methods, diseases continued to take a significant toll. The plague, often brought on by poor hygiene and close living conditions, was especially deadly in the colder months. Without the understanding of germs or infection, people were at the mercy of the environment, their own bodies, and the limited medical practices available at the time. As winter deepened, the struggle to survive intensified. The lack of heating, the scarcity of food, and the cold, damp conditions created a constant battle for warmth and sustenance. People continued to rely heavily on community to get by. Villagers, knowing that isolation could mean death, turned to one another for help. This mutual support went beyond just sharing food or firewood. In the worst winters, it was about physical survival, about having someone to turn to when the cold became too much to bear, or when sickness took hold of the home. The exchange of resources was not just an informal practice, but an essential part of the social fabric of medieval life. Bartering was common, and even small, rural villages had some form of trading system in place to ensure that the needs of the community were met. This system became particularly critical during the winter months, when access to fresh resources was limited. One family might have a surplus of grain, but be lacking firewood, while another had firewood but no grain. The solution to this problem often lay in trading goods: firewood for food, food for clothing, or tools for fire-starting implements. Money was used, but in rural areas, the barter system was the primary means of ensuring survival. In some villages, communal efforts extended to shared winter preparation rituals. These could involve the entire community coming together to prepare for the long winter, storing food, gathering firewood, and fixing up homes. Sometimes these communal gatherings had the added benefit of providing moral support and social cohesion in an otherwise isolating season. It was not uncommon for villagers to share a community meal once the harvest was in, helping to distribute food evenly among the population. Public feasts were organized, especially when one household had a large surplus, which in turn helped strengthen social ties and provide nourishment to the most vulnerable in the village. In some parts of medieval Europe, where large estates were the norm, the landowners were expected to help their tenants. This could include providing food, firewood, and warm clothing. This was particularly important for the poor, who would otherwise have no means of surviving. The winter, lords often distributed supplies from their manorial stores, or would employ their serfs to help with farming, firewood gathering, and other tasks that ensured a steady supply of wood and food during the cold months. While these actions were meant to ensure the survival of the serfs, they were not done purely out of kindness. Serfs were expected to pay their dues through labor and loyalty, even in the depths of winter. In larger towns and cities, however, survival during winter came with its own set of challenges. The urban poor, living in cramped, unsanitary conditions, had fewer resources to withstand the cold. The buildings they lived in were often poorly insulated, and many homes lacked even basic provisions like blankets or adequate clothing. Marketplaces, where goods could be traded and bought, were often closed or reduced in size during the coldest months, leaving people with fewer options for acquiring supplies. While the wealthy could afford better clothing and insulated homes, the poor were left to huddle together near small fires, bundled in whatever layers they could manage, often without sufficient food or protection from the elements. The risk of disease was always high in these crowded, unsanitary conditions, and winter exacerbated this problem. The cold, coupled with the lack of proper hygiene and medical knowledge, made people particularly vulnerable to illness. Plague, pneumonia, and bronchitis spread more easily in the winter due to the close proximity of people in poorly ventilated homes. Additionally, the poor diet of the working class weakened their immune systems, leaving them susceptible to diseases. Frostbite and other cold-related injuries were common, and often, the medieval remedies were no match for the severity of these afflictions. People without the resources to maintain warmth often became sick from exposure. Hypothermia was a constant threat. During prolonged periods of cold, the body loses heat faster than it can generate it, and even the wealthiest homes couldn't fully protect their inhabitants from this phenomenon. It wasn't just about enduring the freezing temperatures, but surviving the aftereffects of prolonged exposure. To counter this, families huddled together for warmth, even those who had no formal space to sleep in. Those with livestock often spent the night in close proximity to them, as the body heat from the animals helped keep them alive. In rural areas, where medical care was minimal, families had to rely on folk remedies to deal with illness and injury. Herbs were used to treat colds, coughs, and aches, while poultices made of mustard seeds or garlic were applied to the chest to alleviate chest infections. Witchcraft and superstitions often played an important role in treating ailments as well. People would visit healers or wise women, seeking advice or potions to combat the cold, often trying a combination of herbs and rituals to ward off illness in the towns. Baths were still common in many areas, though the practice of regular bathing diminished during the medieval period. In winter, the bathhouses were not used as frequently, as the cold made the act of immersing oneself in hot water less appealing. This was a time when people were largely isolated in their homes, rarely leaving except to gather firewood, hunt for food, or engage in other necessary tasks. The long winter months stretched on, with few opportunities for recreation, and a lack of sunlight and fresh air made staying indoors the only option for much of the population. In contrast to the isolation faced by the poor, the nobility had a much easier time during winter. Castles and manor houses were built with the intention of keeping the cold out. Thanks to thick stone walls and fireplaces large enough to heat a room, wealthy individuals had a host of servants to help keep fires burning, prepare food, and ensure that everyone had enough to eat and stay warm. The noble classes often hosted winter feasts, with food served in abundance to keep spirits high during the dreary months. While these privileges ensured comfort for the wealthy, they also reinforced the social divide between the privileged classes and the poor, who lived in cramped, unheated homes. The role of feasts in the winter was important in maintaining the spirit of survival. As food grew scarce and the cold became more biting, these feasts provided both physical warmth and social warmth. For the wealthy, these feasts were more than a way to nourish the body. They were also a way to solidify their position within the community, showcasing their generosity while reinforcing their power. For the poor, attending these feasts was often one of the only opportunities to acquire food outside of their immediate households. When a noble lord or landowner hosted a feast, the village poor were invited to partake, ensuring they would survive until the spring. While medieval people often had to rely on their own resources and the support of their community to survive the winter, there were external forces at play. Weather patterns and the unpredictability of nature often determined the severity of the winter and the survival rates of families. Some winters were mild, and some years brought enough food to sustain the population. But there were also years of famine that left the population vulnerable. Crop failures, unseasonably cold temperatures, and flooding would lead to widespread hunger, causing people to rely even more heavily on their neighbors and local community leaders for support. Medieval winters were not just about endurance, but about the human spirit, how people could adapt to the harshest of conditions. They used everything at their disposal to keep warm, fed, and healthy, and through community, innovation, and shared resources, they managed to make it through. These strategies formed the foundation of survival in medieval society, creating tight-knit communities that were built on the shared need to survive the long, cold months. Though the conditions were difficult and unforgiving, they also inspired a sense of unity and resourcefulness that allowed people to endure and thrive, despite the challenges of the season. As winter dragged on, survival became more of a test of endurance than anything else. Medieval people lived in a world where the seasons controlled much of their existence, and surviving the cold months without modern heating required a constant struggle. The impact of the harsh weather was felt deeply, but people relied on everything available to them to stay warm, find food, and fend off the many dangers posed by the cold. The adaptation strategies they employed were often based on generations of experience, passed down in an oral tradition, and reflected the harsh realities of a medieval life governed by the elements. During these months, the home was not just a shelter, it became the center of survival. The hearth was the beating heart of the house, providing warmth, light, and a place to prepare food. The importance of this singular element cannot be overstated. People of all social classes, regardless of wealth or status, understood the crucial need to keep their fires burning. The fire didn't just warm their homes, it ensured they had food to eat and a means of staying alive. Fire was life. For those living in larger towns and cities, the problem of heating was somewhat alleviated by the presence of more complex architecture. Great halls and noble homes featured large fireplaces and chimneys. The wealthy had rooms designed with insulation in mine-thick stone walls that would hold heat better than the homes of peasants. However, even in these homes, there were parts of the house that remained cold. Kitchens, servant quarters, and storage rooms were often drafty, and the fire in the hearth struggled to warm those spaces. Though the noble classes might have had the best means to survive the cold, they still faced challenges, especially in castles, where the sheer size of the building made it difficult to heat. Noble houses, particularly castles and manors, often had designated spaces where winter warmth could be generated. Great fireplaces, usually in the great hall or drawing room, were designed not just for heating, but as a central feature for the family to gather around. In these larger homes, fireplaces were more elaborate, designed with large chimneys to channel smoke outside, though they still struggled with smoke buildup inside the home. The use of hearthstones became commonplace, and often heated stones were placed in beds to provide warmth at night. These stones, however, were only effective for a short period and required constant tending to maintain warmth. In contrast, peasants and rural families had little luxury when it came to insulation. Mud walls and thatch roofs provided little protection from the wind, and even the simplest cottage could be as cold as the snow-covered ground outside. The hearth was often the only source of warmth, and families would crowd around it, often sleeping in shifts to maximize the heat. Some homes had multiple hearths, one in the kitchen and another in the family room, though these were often poorly ventilated. In these homes, the challenge of managing heat was a daily effort. Even the children had a role in keeping the fire alive, gathering wood and helping maintain the warmth for the household. Life in the countryside during winter also brought with it a deep sense of isolation. Villagers often depended on self-sufficiency, and in many cases, the closest neighbor was miles away. There was little access to fresh food, and getting to market for supplies was near impossible if the weather turned. In the event of a snowstorm or blizzard, families were at risk of being cut off entirely from the outside world. In these circumstances, people relied on what they had stored: root vegetables, cured meats, salted fish, and preserved grains, making do with whatever they had, regardless of whether the meal was enjoyable or not. During such isolation, the family unit became the cornerstone of survival. Extended families often lived together in small one-room cottages, where everyone, from the youngest child to the oldest grandparent, worked together to keep the house functional. The older generations would often teach the younger ones about surviving through the cold months, how to chop and stack wood, how to preserve food for the winter, and how to live off the land. In the long winter nights, families would gather around the hearth, sharing stories, songs, and oral traditions passed down from previous generations. These stories were not only a form of entertainment, but a way to maintain community, spirit, and morale in a time of constant hardship. The need for firewood was so great that firewood collection became an essential community activity. In villages, it wasn't unusual for people to gather in groups to chop wood, especially if they were members of the same family or shared a common woodland. Firewood could often be purchased at the market in larger towns, but for rural families, purchasing it wasn't an option, so gathering it became a year-round activity. The process of cutting, stacking, and preserving firewood for the winter was no small task, and often entire communities were involved in the effort. The colder months also brought about changes in diet. Meat preservation became an essential part of everyday life. Smoking, salting, and drying were the main methods used to keep meat from spoiling, as fresh meat was unavailable in the winter. Many families had a salt cellar or smokehouse in their home where meats and fish were stored. Preserving food in this manner meant people could eat meat throughout the winter, even if it was no longer fresh. Families also preserved vegetables, storing them in root cellars to keep them from freezing. Potatoes, carrots, turnips, and cabbage were staples during the cold months, and these hearty vegetables helped supplement the often meat-heavy diet in wealthier homes. Luxury foods like spiced wine, sweets, and rich pastries were often served during winter feasts. These feasts were a means of celebration, marking the survival of another year through the worst of the cold months. For peasants, however, the focus was on hearty stews and broths made with preserved meats, vegetables, and grains. Bread made from grains such as barley or oats was another winter staple. Ale was also a common winter beverage, helping to boost warmth and morale, though it was usually consumed by the entire household. As the winter progressed, survival continued to revolve around heat management. The ability to preserve warmth and keep the fire burning became paramount. Extra clothing was necessary for everyone, from woolen hats to fur-lined gloves. People would wear their heaviest woolen garments indoors to keep their bodies as warm as possible. Many families also relied on feather bedding to help keep the cold at bay during the night. While wool and fur helped to keep the body warm, they weren't perfect solutions. People still froze if they ventured too far from the hearth. With no modern heating systems, survival was a matter of carefully maintaining warmth, food, and physical health through daily efforts. The cold brought more than physical discomfort. It brought the ever-present fear of illness. Winter was the season for sickness, flu, pneumonia, and other respiratory illnesses flourished in the cold and cramped living spaces. The lack of ventilation in most medieval homes compounded this issue. People who lived near the fire would be exposed to thick smoke, which irritated the lungs and exacerbated the spread of diseases. Additionally, the damp, cold environment encouraged the growth of germs, which could rapidly become epidemics in tightly packed communities. Despite these dangers, the people had little understanding of germs and how they spread. Instead, folk remedies were often used to treat sickness, from herbal teas made from ginger and peppermint to garlic poultices. Even as the people endured the hardships of winter, there were small moments of joy and comfort. The winter months were a time for families to come together, for communities to bond, and for people to take a moment to reflect on survival. These moments, whether gathered around a hearth, sharing food, or telling stories, were as much a part of the winter experience as the cold itself. In a world of constant struggle, the ability to find warmth, both physical and emotional, was essential to getting through another winter. As the winter dragged on, the cycle of survival continued to test the limits of medieval endurance. The extreme cold not only affected people's ability to keep warm, but also their capacity to find food and maintain health. While the arrival of spring was eagerly anticipated, the journey through the last stretch of winter was never easy. Every cold night, every snowstorm, and every day of isolation tested the mettle of those who lived through it. One of the hardest aspects of medieval winter survival was the proximity to death that many families faced. Disease, hunger, and the cold were constant threats. Yet, throughout the darkest days of winter, people found ways to keep hope alive. Survival was not a passive act. It was an active pursuit that required constant effort. Whether it was gathering firewood, preserving food, or tending to the sick, medieval families knew that each day survived was a small victory, even as people had learned to adapt and cope. The arrival of spring remained the ultimate goal. Spring symbolized renewal, a return to warmth, and the opportunity to start fresh. But before the spring thaw came, families had to hold on through the long stretch of cold. Food scarcity became more pronounced as the months passed, and nourishing meals became harder to come by, though some households were fortunate enough to have access to preserved food. The resources they relied on were dwindling. Pickled vegetables, salted meats, and dried fish were increasingly the primary food sources. And by midwinter, even these stores began to dwindle. Salted meats could last a long time, but after months of eating the same meals, the idea of variety became a luxury that few could afford. The rich, with their access to more abundant food stores and luxury items like spices, fared better than the poor, but even they had to rely on what was available. While wealthy homes could afford spiced wine, exotic meats, and sugared treats, the poor lived off stale bread, soup, and whatever wild game or roots they could find in rural communities. Subsistence farming continued, though with limited success. During winter, farmers focused on preserving grains and ensuring that their livestock were kept safe and healthy. The cold weather made farming difficult, but the warmth of animal bodies helped the farm survive. For those who could not afford livestock, survival was even more difficult. The local markets often closed during winter, and even if they stayed open, the goods available were sparse and expensive. This made food inaccessible for many, and people had to rely on their stored provisions to last. The early months of the year were also the time when people were most vulnerable to illness. Without access to modern medicine or sanitation, the threat of disease was omnipresent. Respiratory infections, such as bronchitis and pneumonia, were common during winter, exacerbated by the constant exposure to cold and damp conditions. People who lived in poorly ventilated houses or near the fire were at high risk of developing chronic lung conditions, which would have been fatal without proper treatment. The lack of knowledge about the transmission of diseases meant that medieval people often attributed illness to bad air, evil spirits, or witchcraft. For the poor, medical care was largely a matter of home remedies and herbal treatments. Herbalists were highly valued in medieval communities, as they knew which plants could alleviate symptoms of common winter ailments. These remedies were not always effective, but they provided people with a sense of hope during the cold months when disease seemed to be rampant. Garlic, onions, and ginger were common ingredients used in medicinal concoctions, known for their believed antibacterial properties. However, for the wealthier classes, access to better remedies and medicinal herbs was a privilege. They might have private healers or access to medicinal books, but this was not a guarantee of success. The plague and other deadly diseases were still frequent in Europe, regardless of wealth or status. In rural villages, the winter months also meant that social bonds became a vital part of survival, as people were largely isolated due to the cold. Communities had to work together to ensure that no one was left behind. During particularly harsh winters, entire villages would collect firewood together or help families with food preservation and repairing homes that had been damaged by the storms. Without these communal efforts, survival was even harder, especially when isolation from neighbors could mean starvation or death from cold. Families helped each other, even with the little they had. It wasn't uncommon for someone with extra firewood to share it with a neighbor, or for those who had more preserved food to offer some to those who had run out. This spirit of mutual aid was a cornerstone of medieval survival. Villages often had local leaders, such as a lord or a community elder, who would ensure that everyone's needs were met. They might organize winter festivals where people came together to share food, sing, and celebrate survival in the darkest months of the year. These gatherings also helped keep morale high and prevented the emotional toll of winter isolation from becoming overwhelming in the wealthier homes. Servants and attendants were often responsible for ensuring that the fire remained burning throughout the day and night. These servants would often sleep close to the hearth to ensure the fire didn't go out, often using the heat to warm their own bodies. Noble families had more resources, but they still faced the same isolation and cold. The noble classes didn't have the same daily hardships as peasants, but their luxurious homes were still affected by the cold, and even with the wealth to afford extra firewood, there was still social tension between those who were better off and those who struggled to survive. The journey through the long, cold months was not just physical, it was deeply emotional. The psychological strain of the winter months could affect both the young and the old. Isolation, the constant fear of famine, and the vulnerability to disease weighed heavily on the minds of medieval people. In the absence of modern medicine or entertainment, winter nights could stretch on endlessly. People gathered around the hearth and told stories and legends, often of heroes and adventurers who overcame extreme challenges, stories that were meant to inspire hope, no matter how grim the present might seem. As the last weeks of winter finally passed, people eagerly awaited the first signs of spring. The arrival of warmer days brought hope for better times. The earth began to warm, the snow began to melt, and the first signs of new life appeared. In villages, this marked the time to plant the first seeds, and families could now look forward to the harvest of the coming year. The return of the sun provided not only physical warmth, but also emotional relief, as people could finally begin to look beyond the hardships of winter and towards the renewal of life that came with spring. The arrival of spring was not just a change in the weather, it was a renewal. It symbolized a fresh start, the chance to plant new crops, and the ability to gather fresh food. People would celebrate surviving the winter and give thanks for the chance to start anew. Spring also meant a reconnection with the outside world, as the thawed roads allowed for trade and travel. The isolation of winter was over, and life began to move forward once again. Even with the difficult seasons behind them, the memories of surviving a medieval winter were never forgotten. People would tell stories of how they kept each other warm, how they survived on the smallest rations, and how they leaned on their neighbors and families to make it through another brutal season. These tales, passed from one generation to the next, formed the backbone of medieval society's ability to endure. Though each winter was harsh and each season uncertain, the cycle continued, with people forever adapting and finding ways to survive against the odds. As the weather gradually warmed and the final vestiges of winter faded, the arrival of spring was more than just a seasonal change. It marked the beginning of recovery, the renewal of life after months of hardship. Medieval people, despite the toll that winter had taken on their physical, emotional, and social well-being, found themselves reawakening along with the earth. The cold season, with its relentless challenges, had driven communities to their limits. But now, as the first signs of spring emerged, the people had a chance to rebuild and renew. Spring's arrival was not just a reprieve from the cold. It was the beginning of the cycle of survival. As the weather warmed, people eagerly returned to their fields and gardens, now free from the grasp of winter's chill. In the countryside, this was the time for farmers to plant spring crops: wheat, oats, barley, and other staple grains. These crops would be harvested in the fall, providing much-needed sustenance through the year. But the early spring planting was crucial for the coming months. It was the first step in preparing for another cycle of survival and the growing season ahead. However, the arrival of spring did not immediately end all of the challenges brought on by winter. For many rural families, resources had been depleted by the harshness of the past months. The final stretch of winter had tested the last reserves of food stores, and even the wealthiest families could still face shortages. The spring thaw brought new hope, but it also highlighted how fragile survival could be. Late frosts, unpredictable weather, and pest infestations were all part of the risk that people faced. The survival of a community often depended on timely planting, cooperative labor, and good fortune. Any delay in planting or an unexpected frost could ruin a harvest, and hunger would set in again. The medieval farm was designed for hard work, and during spring, farmers were constantly engaged in tasks that ranged from tilling the soil to seeding and fertilizing. The process was physically demanding, and success was never guaranteed. Even if the soil was rich and the weather was favorable, farmers still faced many obstacles. Drought, pests, and flooding could destroy an entire year's worth of work. Families had to remain vigilant, constantly working the land, tending to livestock, and protecting their crops from the many dangers that came. With the change of season, communities continued to rely on their shared labor during these months. In medieval villages, tasks like plowing, harvesting, and planting were often done in groups, with everyone contributing in some way to the collective effort. The practice of cooperative farming was not only practical, but also necessary for survival. A single family could not work a large field on its own, but by pooling resources and dividing labor, entire villages could ensure that they had enough food for the coming year. One of the most critical aspects of spring survival was the care and management of livestock. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs were kept throughout the winter in barns or stables to provide both food and warmth. As the weather improved, these animals were allowed to graze in the open fields, and their care became a priority for the community. Animal husbandry was both a source of food and a symbol of wealth. Those with large herds could afford to trade meat, wool, and dairy for other goods. Meanwhile, those with fewer animals were forced to rely on the generosity of their wealthier neighbors, as it was nearly impossible to survive the long months of winter without the warmth and sustenance that livestock provided. For the medieval community, the spring planting season was a time of intense labor and the first step in ensuring food security for the year. Early spring was also marked by religious observances, as people sought divine intervention for a good harvest. Churches were filled with prayers for fertile soil and abundant crops, and many medieval people believed that their spiritual well-being was directly tied to the success of their harvests. The church calendar, with its many feast days and fasting periods, often aligned with the agricultural cycle, and it was through these religious practices that communities found a sense of purpose and guidance. As the season changed, so too did the rhythms of medieval life. The arrival of warmer weather meant a return to longer workdays, with sunlight extending the hours in which people could toil. Evenings, once spent huddled around the hearth to keep warm, became times of gathering and celebration. It was during this time that villagers would come together to celebrate spring festivals, way to acknowledge the struggles of the past winter, while also looking forward to the new beginnings of the year. These festivals included dancing, feasting, and community rituals, where the villagers gave thanks for the survival of the season and the hope that the coming year would be more prosperous in wealthier households. The arrival of spring marked a return to outdoor activities. Noble families would begin to spend more time outdoors, hunting, attending courts, and holding banquets in the fresh air. It was a time for nobles to enjoy the fruits of their labor, to showcase their power and wealth, and to solidify their position within the larger community. Public festivals were common during this time, and they helped strengthen the bonds between the rich and the poor, as commoners were often invited to partake in the celebrations. In contrast, life for the rural poor remained difficult despite the promise of spring. The early spring was a time of hard work, but it was also the beginning of the long road to survival. The fields had to be tended, crops sown, and animals cared for, all under the looming threat of possible failure. A late frost could destroy a crop, and there was never enough food to last until the harvest. Social support remained a cornerstone of survival for these communities. Bartering, cooperation, and mutual aid were vital for ensuring that everyone had access to what they needed. Despite the unpredictability of the seasons, people knew they had to persevere through the challenges. Spring was a time of hope, but it was also a reminder of how quickly things could go wrong. The survival of one year did not guarantee that the next would be easier. Famine, pestilence, and war could wipe out entire communities in the blink of an eye. Yet, through all of these challenges, medieval people found ways to keep going, adapting to each new set of obstacles. The importance of community, adaptation, and shared resources was woven throughout medieval society. Whether they were gathering around a hearth, planting crops, or celebrating the return of warmer weather, people knew that their strength came from each other. The support they gave to one another, whether through sharing firewood, trading food, or simply spending time together, was what kept them going through the toughest times. And as the days grew longer, they would face the new season with the knowledge that survival, while difficult, was always within their grasp if they worked together.